Okay, and I guess we'll just start the session. Yeah, so welcome to the third webinar of our webinar series, and we have Bonfilio with us. So before starting the session, I will give a little bit of introduction in case anyone here is not familiar with him yet. So he is the champion and the best speaker of the 2020 NSDC last year. And he's also part of the Indonesian team participating in WSDC this year. So welcome, Bonfilio, everyone. All right, so Bonfilio, yeah, you can start.
Thank you for having me. So I guess I'll share my screen and we can start with the presentation. Can I just confirm that everyone can see this?
Yeah, it is here. It is visible on my end.
Okay, thank you. All right, so hi everyone. As was introduced earlier, my name is Bonfilio Dazzle. I actually go by Dazzle, and I participated in a lot of debating competitions over the last year. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about self-training, specifically on how you can sort of progress in your debating journey outside of just passively taking in input from your coaches, but also how you can make it an active process where you're constantly improving yourself if you're hitting plateaus in your journey. So before I move on to any content in this seminar, I want to give a few credits because as you'll see later on, none of this is invented by me. These are all tips and tricks I've gotten from senior debaters, from my coaches, and also from these following resources that I used to prepare the seminar. When I was starting off as a debater, I used Kaitkon's training guide, for example, to start a routine in how I approach doing my speeches, specifically third speeches as well. And there are obviously a lot of coaches and senior debaters that I cannot mention who thankfully gave me those tips, and I'm going to be sharing with you today. The first thing I want to start off with is to introduce a framework and to establish that self-training is actually important. And I think this is largely because of two things. The first is that it helps you sort of maintain a consistent form of progress, and it also allows you to expand your knowledge in debates that might be a bit more complex. So things such as IR debates, things such as economics debates as well. Sometimes you also just don't have access to a coach, or like maybe you're the first debater in your school and you're starting off a debate club. So independence can be useful. And I think the case in point here is how I also self-train. So during NSDC selections to the Jakarta selections, I did not have a coach. It was largely just online resources and me sort of training by myself, recording myself speaking. Of course, after those selections, I did end up having a coach, and that serves a different purpose of actually, working with a team and sort of criticizing your speeches in a more experienced manner because they're better debaters than I am. But self-training outside of that, I think, is also largely important. The third thing as part of this seminar is to definitely don't hesitate to ask questions. I want this seminar to be as applicable as possible, because if you've joined previous seminars, which may be based on things such as, the exact debating theory, I want this to be more of a seminar about sharing resources. So training routines to improve your skills, which leads me on to my last thing, that some things may work better for different people. The way you sort of practice and research is going to have to be personalized to yourself, but I'm going to give you maybe like a rough outline that also lets you know what exactly you can try out and see if that works out for you. Cool, so the contents of the seminar can roughly be broken down into four things. First thing I'm going to talk about is case building, specifically just independently what you should be doing as a practice routine to improve your speeches. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how you can learn from past debates, from YouTube, especially what to look out for when you're like watching debates by more experienced debaters. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about research, how you can find matter, because debate is all about expanding knowledge, especially with the advent of really long context slides. And lastly, I'm going to talk about this miscellaneous bits about how you can improve like different aspects of your style, how you can overcome like the barrier to actually improving. So starting off with the first one, let's talk about case building. And I think this is the most straightforward one. And to start off this section of the seminar, I think there are several things to sort of think about. The first is that you probably want to understand the basics first and make sure you got those down. So know what a rebuttal is, know what an argument is, what are probably the basic structures of each one. This seminar does not cover that. There are a lot of better resources, such as previous RIDC seminars that will be uploaded on YouTube as well. So make sure you got those down, because those will help you identify what areas you're particularly lacking in. So the main thing, and the main thing you're going to work on during this process, is to work on 1 or 2 points that you think are most important. And the way you do this is to think about the feedback or the oral adjudications that you have recently gotten, either from SPARs or either from like certain competitions that you'll be joining. Our IDC is a good example of this, because it is definitely possible that you have feedback during a competition and you apply it immediately in the next round. So these can be very overwhelming. And I know this because like when you have an oral adjudication, kaya juri niya ngomongnya panjang banget and you don't know exactly what they're trying to say, you might not understand it. You might be very tired after a debate round and like your brain is just not working. So it is probably impossible for you, or maybe it's hard for you to write down every single thing and every single piece of feedback. So what I would suggest is to focus on 1 or 2 points that are the biggest and the most glaring mistakes you have made that maybe lost you the round or maybe gave you like really low speaker scores. So it might be things such as exclusivity. It might be things such as like, argument processing, or you didn't have a good setup. Whatever it is, you ought to write it down in big, bold letters. Like I usually like take a piece of paper, I write down big, bold letters and remember that for the next speech. If you don't have a judge or a coach, what I would suggest is to think about parts where you're personally feel you're not as confident in, because I think when you're starting off a speech, like you might already know, you like have that gut feeling that this might not be my best speech, maybe because the rebuttals are like, you're not confident enough in the rebuttals. So the places where you're slightly less confident in are likely to be places where you are not good at, simply because like you don't do it with ease or you're stumbling throughout those things. So ask that question to yourself. Is it that you have trouble coming up with distinct rebuttals? Are you repeating certain things, etc.? So the takeaway from this is to just identify those 1 or 2 things, and then you improve that using the following method, which I'm going to go over to now. So before I go on to the actual method or the way I think you can improve, I'm going to immediately share the resources that I use. So I use 2 resources here. The first is Hello Motions, which is very, very useful. It's an entire repository of motions from like 2013 or like 2010 up until the most recent one is 2020. So it is less updated, but Hello Motions is really good because you have a randomized motion feature. You can use that for practice anytime. What I will say is that even though some of the motions are outdated or maybe like, happening like 5-6 years ago, I think those things can still be useful, simply because I noticed as a trend that there's recently a return of sort of like old former motions. So there was recently a tournament that set the motion on like setting the minister's wage to the median wage of that particular country, which first came out in 2013, but then came out again in 2021. So having those old motions or simple motions is not a bad thing, insofar as you're also able to sort of make the perfect case for that, and maybe you can apply some of those arguments to more complex motions later on. So that's the first resource. The second resource is far more updated, and I don't know if a lot of people know about this, but this is actually like a lifesaver for me. This is called the Global Debating Spreadsheet, and I put the link there. And like any link, like everything in this slide will be shared in the link tree, so don't worry about that. This spreadsheet is technically like a database of every single debate competition that exists internationally, which is the main purpose of this spreadsheet. This was collated by WUDC 2022 and 2023 core adjudication panel. And this is what the tabs 2021, 2022, and schools are for. It's a list of every single debate tournament that you can join in the future, the registration fee, like the Google Forms to register, etc. But the important piece of this spreadsheet for today's seminar is the tab section, which is basically like a list of every single tabulation, every single record of debate competitions coming from 2022 to 2021 from different parts of the world. This is incredibly helpful for you to find like different types of motions and more complex types of motions. And it's very updated because it's crowdsourced. You can see the Indonesian NUDC one was just updated like this morning, and I saw that. Cool. So with those two resources in mind, this will be sort of the bank of motions that you will use for the following process. Let's actually go into what that is. So how does the method work? And I think the method is pretty straightforward. So it's not about actually doing it. It's about how and what approach you should take when practicing. I think the first thing is pretty simple. Choose a motion from the list of motions and the resources that I just talked about. What I will say is that you ought to prioritize something that you're either bad at or not confident in, or something that you might want to research later on because you think it's interesting, or because it's something that you see that it's a trend that's becoming important in the debating community. On research, there's more on that later, so don't worry. But for example, I used to prioritize different motion types as well. So I was incredibly bad at narrative debates because those were too abstract for me. So I would search up those and do my method using exclusively those motions. The second thing to do is to actually case build. This is the most straightforward one. Using all the templates, using all the knowledge you have, try your best to actually make a speech out of that. There are two things to note. The first is to use less time than necessary. So if you are in Asian parliamentary, that's usually 30 minutes of case building, use 25. If you're in BP, which is 15 minutes, use 12 minutes maximum. The reason why is because like in reality, you will never actually get the full amount of case building to actually do a motion. You will be, I don't know, stressed out. You will like take some time to read the context slide. You will need to calm yourself down. You will need to, I don't know, switch Zoom breakout rooms or actually like walk to the room if it's a physical competition, like offline competition. So this sort of just trains your brain to be flexible and to work under time pressure. The second thing is to remember where you want to improve on that you identified earlier. And this is particularly important because it is like, I think a pitfall that I personally went through, and maybe some debaters also went through, is that there is a tendency for you to gravitate towards things that you're already good at. So for example, if you're writing on a piece of paper without structure, like you're just writing out a normal speech, you might not realize that you're lacking in some parts because what you do is that, oh, I think weighing is easier, or answering the even if is easier, or doing rebuttals is easier. So I'll just do that and neglect other parts of my speech. When case building ends, you'll end up with like so much weighing or so much framing that you don't actually talk about the argument because you left that until the end. So what you need to do here is to prioritize the things that you want to improve on. If you have to neglect other things that you know you're already okay at or decent in, then just do so, because I think focusing on that one area of improvement is far more important. Last thing is to definitely record yourself, re-listen to your speech if you want. Here, you might want to criticize as much as possible. And even though the criticism is limited, because maybe you're not as experienced or you're also listening to yourself and you think you're already good, there's always room, for example, maybe in your manner, maybe you are like you stutter a lot, or maybe there are certain ideas that you could have conveyed more effectively. Usually re-listening to that speech allows you to identify certain problems, but of course, don't be too harsh. If you don't want to re-listen to your speech, that is completely fine. I have an entire folder in my laptop where I just record speeches and never look at them again. Some of them I delete, some of them is just there. And the reason why is because I think the act of recording, especially in the online sort of debating environment, allows you to be more serious and allows you to actually be in the zone that I'm actually doing a speech and I want this to be a good one and I'm recording it for something. So that's just the basic outline of the method. And now I'm going to give you an example. So the example here is, the motion is, this house regrets the emphasis on textbook-based education in secondary schools. And this was a practice I did. I didn't technically do a speech on this, but we did practice on how much you can case build in 12 minutes. So I did this with my BP partner, Jen, who's also giving a seminar on Monday. So make sure you join that. But the thing that we try to do and our focus, the focus point that we want to improve on, was specifically only on the number of mechanisms and the quality of those mechanisms. And if you don't know what mechanisms mean, mechanisms are simply just a fancy way of saying reasons why something is true. So it's just a different word for it. So we absolutely did not care about the setup. We sort of just left that because we thought that, I think setup is fine, so we're just going to leave that. So we focused specifically on the insides of the argument. We also did not do a lot of weighing because we wanted to see how much can we describe the process of textbook-based education. And here we forced ourselves to have at least 2 points to talk about, and we tried to elaborate it in detail. As you can see on the left, that was my sort of writing. I'm not saying those are particularly good mechs, but you just need to get it down on paper or down on a Google Doc somewhere. It does not matter. And on the right, you see that there's Jen's mechs, and I did not write that in detail because we were just comparing our mechanisms. I think this also highlights how you can probably try to find someone to practice this with together, maybe your partner, maybe your teammate, because it allows you to consolidate the different ways you write reasons. What I mean by this is that my reasons are particularly shallow because there's only 2 of them. And there are different ways that Jen sort of breaks down into 4 different ideas that I could have done as well. So allowing that comparison means that you're able to sort of cover up for each other, and I get new ideas from things that I did not think of before. Why is this particularly useful? This is useful because when you sort of have a different debate on this similar topic, like education, most of those mechanisms that your teammate has already told you or you've checked with each other can actually be applicable to those debates. So for example, if it's an education debate, it's almost always going to be about workplace and like whether or not you are preparing students for the real world. So having a list of mechanisms that you already practice with allows you to sort of apply that to different motions in the future. So this is just an example of how you can do that practice of thinking as much as you can and trying to speak it out. Now, this is where I think a lot of people struggle with, myself included, because sometimes we know that kita tahu arah argumennya ke situ, we just don't really know how to prove it or how to make our argument stronger. So when in doubt, I always go for templates. And what I mean by templates is that there are usually similar ways of answering a certain question di dalam argument. Obviously, don't let templates constrain you. This is just a disclaimer. Some motions will require different burdens, different ways of explaining things. But if you're absolutely stuck during that practice, I think practicing using a template can also actually be very useful. What I mean? So in an argument, there are usually like a typical flow, right? So for example, there's the assertion, there's the analysis of likelihood, there's the impacting, maybe there's a comparative. But a good argument would always have things such as an even if, which is like a preemption towards the opposition case. So if opposition says, even if this harm X is true, you need to respond to that in some way to make sure that that argument is particularly strong. Another thing is on weighing. So for example, opposition proves that they protect some actor, maybe like poor individuals that are white, for example, but you prove that you protect the vast majority of African-American individuals and need to weigh against those options, for example. So there are usually very similar ways you can apply like answers to those questions. And I've listed some of those here. What I will say is that you try to force yourself to answer those questions by using similar lines of logic. So if you want to answer even if, maybe you can say, even if blah, blah, blah happens, the comparative in their world is going to be much worse. Or even if this happens, it's fine because blah, 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 blah. And I'll give you an example of this in the next slide. If it's on weighing, like comparing 2 different arguments, one, like which one is more important, you can always go for the size of the impact. So for example, this gives them like bad economic conditions, which harms their entire family, or this affects more people and therefore the impact is larger. You can also do things such as exclusivity. So for example, the benefits under their side is not exclusive. We can still gain like some protection for them, some protection for African Americans, for example, through legislation. And therefore you should opt for this exclusive motion. Or you can also weigh out the best case and the worst case of your side. So what is the example of this? The example of this is the motion you see on screen. So when I was case building this motion, this House believes that educational institutions should heavily de-emphasize the value of academic excellence. Basically, whether or not sekolah should have like A, B, C, D, E, or we should just say that they pass or fail. So there's absolutely no scoring from 1 to 100, simply only whether you pass or where you fail. So there's no distinction between a person who's really good in class, like gets 90 above, and a person who's just barely passing like 60. This is how you de-emphasize the value of self-training, the value of academic excellence. So as opposition, there are usually ways to answer common parts of your argument, because a government team might say, oh, this is good because academic excellence will make people feel like not confident with themselves when they see that they are failing in relation to other classmates. So for example, people who are not talented academically will be shamed by the class, even though they have passions that lie elsewhere. Misalnya, they are more athletic or they go towards basketball, but they fail at school. So they are shamed by the teacher when they see that the score, even though it passed, the score is still very low. So as opposition, I would just accept this argument to be true. And I would force myself to sort of answer, okay, even if athletic students lack academically, even if they get shamed, blah, 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 blah. And I want to fill that in. So using the template earlier, there are two ways to answer this. One, the comparative is worse. And two, it's fine because something, something, something. So I'm going to try and think of that. And what I thought of is two. The first is that their comparative is worse because students that gain academic validation, so for example, people at the top, will instead be ignored. So people who put more effort into their studies will instead like not be appreciated for those studies. So that comparative is much worse when they don't have validation at all. But a second way I might answer that is that, oh, it's fine because the people who fail at school, for example, they're not quite talented in chemistry, they can always look for success in other fields. So for example, if they're athletic and they don't focus too much on school studies, they will achieve success in like soccer training academy or in like basketball training academy and be part of the national team. So that's how you force yourself to answer certain parts of the argument by using those templates. Moving on. There are some final notes at the end of this section. So I've talked about the method, I've talked about forcing yourself. The final note here that you need to understand is two things. The first is that if you're focusing on processing certain arguments, you need to force yourself to explain the real world implications of that as well. You need to really go to the nitty-gritty of what happens in the real world. The second thing is that if you're up to it and you're up for a challenge, try and learn to improvise as well. So when you're doing your speech, and I just realized I also do this subconsciously, sometimes you would think of a motion and just immediately try and say as much as you can about that motion for 2 to 3 minutes. It doesn't have to be a complete speech, just maybe one argument or one point. The reason why I think this skill is important, like learning to improvise and talking without notes at all, is because there are some debates where you have to be very, very flexible, because sometimes, unknowingly, you might come up with a case and then it turns out to be the wrong case, or like it's a wrong definition. So you need to completely change your case if you're a second speaker maybe. Or for example, like you leave a section of your rebuttals empty, but like the timekeeper is already sort of forcing you to start your speech and you don't have time to write it down. So learning to improvise those bits and think about things on the fly, I think is also an important skill, although it might be more beneficial like later on if you're just trying to like get out of a plateau in your progress. So I want to talk about the first thing tadi to sort of exemplify my point. i.e. that you should try and think about the nitty-gritty and give the practical example as much as possible. So the motion I used here is that this house prefers economic reparations, like the examples shown above, to political reparations when we're dealing with disprivileged groups. So for example, African-American groups, women, etc. So the main claim that I want to forward maybe is something like, this is as opposition, yeah? As opposition, I want political reparations. So I might say that economic reparations are maybe not the most important issue. And even if it is the most important issue, we don't know for sure. Therefore, you need to opt into something that is more flexible, because different privileged groups will have different needs. Some of them need economic reparations. Some of them need like social reparations. Some of them want police reform, which is the example that I give here, right? So many African Americans may instead prefer protection in terms of political reform and instead of like economic reparations. So what I did here is to provide an example that is clear and that is relevant, so that when the judge is thinking back to my point, they're not thinking about it in abstract terms. This I think is very important when you're self-training, because the more examples you can sort of like integrate into your arguments, the easier it is for the judge to understand. And it becomes almost like an intuition that you're explaining your point with that example, like sort of weaved into the point, which makes it, I think, way more persuasive. The second example here for you is, maybe I want to run a second claim that political reparations is far harder to reverse, because if it's economic reparations, it's very easy to screw up the effects of it. So for example, when you do like investments towards, or like direct payments towards certain communities, they might invest it into something that is risky, and therefore suddenly the money is gone. And even worse, the state will avoid responsibility because they say, but I've already given you money. Or for example, there are external factors to economic shocks that will make the community unable to sustain themselves, and instead the economic reparations become useless. Those are the specific examples that I think you can use to illustrate why economic reparations does not work, and forcing yourself to actually think about why those examples happen, to give 1 or 2 lines of actual real world examples, I think is also a good practice to insulate your argument and make it much better. On comparative, you cannot rely on like reversing political rights. You cannot really do that. And it's much easier to shield yourself against the harm. So for example, if you have quotas in parliament, you have more power to criticize or to compromise with incumbent government. So that is another example of political reparations. That is the reason why you should also use the examples given in the info slide, because those things can also sort of insulate your argument. So practicing with those examples is very important. Overall, I think you need to go from perfect to improvised. So if you have time to do it, sometimes you might want to like get a motion, or maybe one you've done, and really perfect what the case or what the speech should look like word for word. Personally, I do it word for word. If you don't want to do it word for word, you don't have to. This is called a recase. And over time, you know what a perfect flow looks like and what a perfect structure actually looks like. But over time, you also want to rely less on that and become more improvised. So the use of this perfect structure or this perfect speech that you made is not to copy it in the next debate. It's just so you know in your mind, okay, this is what an ideal speech looks like. How can I do this in future debates to make it as close as possible? How can I improvise my speech to actually do that? Right. So that's the first part of the seminar on case building. Now we're going to talk about how you can specifically use past debates to actually self-train as well. This is, I think, largely more applicable to responsive speeches, because if you're a first speaker, you can train by yourself, like take a motion and just case build and speak it out. If you're a responsive speaker, such as a second speaker or a third speaker, it's much harder to do it by yourself because you don't have anyone to respond to you. So I think using videos is largely more important. I listed some of those here, so you can use a variety of resources. Some more complex VP debates, like on the university level, include HWSRR, WUDC, EUDC, and so on. In high school, I would definitely recommend just watching WSDC videos. specifically the ones on YouTube and also on Facebook. So how do you actually use this particular method of self-training? So once you've selected a video, and once you already know the motion of that video, similar rules as before, you want to be case building, but this time it's up to you whether or not you want to really detail it out or just list the basic points that you have, because there might be things that you don't really know how to prove, and that's what the video is for, because that video is a reference. But whatever it is, case build beforehand so you know how much you can actually do in comparison to a very experienced speaker as well. Second thing to do is to actually just watch the video, to take transcripts and take notes of very important points and mechanisms. So the example of a transcript I did is on the right. I think transcripting is very useful. Just pure notes on what the speaker has said. For this particular motion, it was from the HWSRR. This house supports the cult of productivity. Speaker was Naomi Panofka, which is really detailed in the way she explains certain arguments. So that's why I transcripted this one particularly. The third thing, and when you already have a transcript or you already know what a good speaker looks like, is to actually get a takeaway from that. Like, what can I learn from the speaker? I think the main thing you can learn from the speaker is not only the content, but to pay careful attention on how they structure and how they flow their arguments. A lot of the speakers that are better don't necessarily have very complex or very bizarre ideas. These are often things that we already intuitively know or we can understand. It's just that they flow and structure their speech in a very clear and concise way that every single word they say has a use and has a value to the debate. So paying careful attention to how they flow is very important. In this particular example, the way she flows her speech is to first make a claim, then to talk about why opposition is bad or why there are no alternatives to giving fulfillment, because that's the end goal that they want. And the last part of the flow is to talk about why the comparative on your side, why the government's comparative is much more accessible, much better, etc. So this simple structure can already sort of give you an idea of what parts of an argument you need to fill and what ideally a good speaker in this particular motion would look like. Speakers also sort of flow their arguments differently each time. So you might also want to take note of the ways you can flow your argument. So the first part was one way to do it. You can do claim, why opposition is bad, why government is good. Or you can do what Naomi did in her second argument. So claim, then you start off with some framing, which is just talking about the context. The context in this case is this part here, that productivity is not the cause of capitalism, but it is a symptom. So capitalism is going to exist under both sides. That is the general frame of that argument. Then they immediately go to why the cult of productivity can actually lead you to gain better fulfillment and gain better self-care, which immediately clashes or immediately responds to a possible opposition claim. The fourth thing, I guess, is to say that many types of debates have very similar mechanisms or proofs or very similar explanations. As I hinted on earlier, in education, pasti ngomonginnya cuma workplace, pasti ngomonginnya cuma creativity, itu aja. So there are obviously things to learn here. Things like debates about personal fulfillment or personal relationships. Biasanya mechanismnya is also very similar, like the value we get from work or the value we get from self-care, etc. So learning the content of the speeches, I think, is also very useful, and applying them to your own practice speeches to fill in the gaps where you did not actually think of that topic. Maybe write it in a red pen so you remember it for the next time you do that. Alternatively, you can also just copy the structure if you did not like the content. There's always something to learn from experienced debaters as well. Final notes under this second part of the seminar. When practicing responsive speeches, what you would do is probably watch part of the debate. So if you're a third speaker, watch the first government, first op, second government, second op. and do an actual third gov speech as if you were part of that team, what you want to be doing then is to compare what you said as rebuttals, simulate your own speech, and try to compare with what the particular speaker has said, especially if it's a really good whip speaker, to sort of take note of certain points they made or certain ways that they phrase their arguments that makes it much simpler. Again, so compare with the rest of the video, also fill in the gaps. It's also actually a good starting point for research and new knowledge, which I'm going to go on later. There are usually some things that when you're case building, you can't just think of. So having a speaker that's more experienced than you give you those arguments can actually be very useful. For example, this motion was assuming feasibility. This House would remove the ability of soldiers to feel fear. I transcripted Heather Goldberg. I did not think of the ethical warfare argument at all, but now it's sort of ingrained in my memory, and I know I can just apply it in any future debate as well. So leading on from the last part, I said that transcripting is a good start for research, simply because you already know what arguments are relevant. So you just need to have statistics, cuman perlu kayak data to back up those arguments. So this leads me on to the third part of my seminar, specifically on research. Now, the framework for research, I think, is to be very specific. Good research is specific research. So it's not really helpful for you to sort of go onto the Wikipedia page of cryptocurrency, or like go onto the Wikipedia page of the World Bank and like look through the history of the World Bank. It might be helpful, but maybe not much of it, because the value of research, at least in the debate context, research is only valuable insofar as you can apply it to a debate or apply it to your own arguments. So if it's research about something that is not particularly important or not particularly contentious, nobody's gonna question it, so there is no use to that particular form of research. So what I would suggest is to find a motion first and then research, in comparison to just researching broadly, which of course you can do as well if you want, but it takes far more time to find the debate application of that research. The thing to note here is that arguments are far more important than matter or statistics. So you need to think, what you need to research when you're doing like matter is not really like statistics, like percentages about like how many people are in poverty. It's more on the reasons and the arguments why they are in poverty. How are we able to get them out of poverty, for example, which is far more relevant and just expands your knowledge. If you do not have a motion, or when the event you're trying to research is very new and you cannot find a motion for it, but you know it's going to come up in a future competition, I would suggest researching three things. The first is actor incentives. So who are the people or the organizations? Misalnya, if it's an IR debate, what are the interests of China? What are the interests of Israel? What is the interest of the US now that Joe Biden is in power? That's the first thing. The second thing is on specific and current context. So what recent events has happened that changed something in the way the world works? I'll give an example for this. And thirdly, just first principles. And what I mean by first principles is just common arguments and common ideas that always come up in that type of debate. So if you're researching about education, as I talk about the workplace, research more statistics on how applicable education is actually in the workplace. What is the employability of certain like graduates or certain types of majors, for example. So I'll give an example of this. Let's say I know that a major competition that I'm going to join soon is going to have something on the Taliban. I absolutely know nothing about the Taliban, so I want to research on it without a motion, because there isn't a motion yet. Even though there actually is in a recent competition, they were pretty fast with it. But let's assume that there is no motion. So I would sort of split my Google Docs, or like split whatever medium we're working on, to three parts. Firstly, on actor incentives. Secondly, on current context. Thirdly, on first principles. So firstly, on the incentives, pretty straightforward. The Taliban wants to impose strict version of Islamic law. The important thing is that when you're looking at one particular actor, especially if it's like an international relations debate or an economics debate or a politics debate, don't be confined to that one actor or that one person or that one organization, because it is almost always the case that they will interact with other people. So for example, the Taliban works with the Pakistani government. The Pakistani government supports the Taliban, protects them within their borders. And you also need to give reasons sort of why they do that. And you need to research those reasons as well. Because if you're in a debate and you say, but the Pakistani government supports the Taliban, and then your opposition says, no, they don't, because they're scared of getting backlash from the US, for example, you will lose, even though it is factually true that they support the Taliban, if you do not give reasons for it or you do not process why that characterization is true. So the specific form of research you want is not only to find facts, but also to find underlying reasons as much as possible. Another example is China, that wants to maintain stability in the region to prevent things such as spillover, which is the reason why they're negotiating with the Taliban. On current context, I just skimmed the headlines for this morning. Obviously, there's way more to the situation than what I put on the slides, but this is sort of like the basic outline or the basic framework that you want to have, so you can follow it up with more research later on. So you know that the Taliban has taken over Kabul, that there's a pullout of US troops, that there's a Trump-Taliban peace deal that you don't actually know about. The important thing here is to follow up those questions. So for example, why is it that the US troops pulling out is so significant? How much power does the US actually give towards the Afghan army? Are statistics that you want to find. Also things such as why, right? Like why did the Biden administration actually withdraw troops? The last section is to talk about first principles. And this is just to take your research and make it very general and make it sort of like apply to different types of debates. So in general, if we're not talking about the Taliban, we can ask the question, does military intervention actually work when dealing with terrorist groups? Like in the case of the US, does negotiation work in the case of the Trump-Taliban peace deal? And whether or not US is the best actor to sort of intervene in many places, because we know the US does that. So asking those questions is helpful as well. Another example of this is this House believes that green political parties should take pro-capitalist stances and be willing to form coalitions with right-wing parties. I'm just going to sort of flash what the research looks like, just to give another example. But for this motion, I wanted to start off with something I already know, so I have a direction, right? If it's the Taliban example, I don't really have a direction of it because I don't have a motion. But I want to know from this motion alone, what can I infer about the topic? So there are two things, I think. The first is that there must be some urgency. Pasti ada reason why the motion is given. Kenapa tiba-tiba green political parties harus take pro-capitalist stance? So maybe it's something to do with political incentive. I don't know specifically yet because I haven't done the research. Second thing I know outside of the motion, itu misalnya right-wing ideology in Europe is actually increasing. So for example, the AfD in Germany misalnya. From that, I can make my research, and if anyone wants to take a screenshot or whatever, feel free to do so. I've done the incentives on the left. So the green parties care about the environment, but they were traditionally anti-capitalist and was leftist. And I'll give certain examples of that as well, so I can throw them out in a debate whenever I need to. I'll go to the current context as to why these parties have actually failed. So they are painted as elitist, misalnya, or there's actually a high unemployment in Europe, which is the reason why they are not popular, because they advocate for like less industrial development, misalnya. But they might actually not be failing. And you, in your research, you should try and also come up with counter examples, because you never know which side of the debate you're getting on. So try to make it not one-sided as much as possible. The third thing is on first principles. So from that context, I realized that this debate is about how much votes you can have, how much political power you can have. So from that, I can apply that in all politics debates, it's actually always a discussion of how do we get the most amount of voters? How do we get specific types of voters that will vote for our ideology? The last thing is what a coalition actually is, because coalition is a big word. I don't know the specific like implications of a coalition. So what I researched is that there's a change in ideology. So in Austria, there was a green political party that now works with the APP, which is a right-wing party. And now the APP did things such as anti-immigration policies, which was directly oppositional to what the Austria Green political party actually wanted. This is also another one. I don't want to make the seminar too long, so feel free to take a screenshot. But again, basically I did first principles, context, and incentives. For this particular debate, I switched it around simply because I already know that in a criminal justice debate, I care about very similar things. So for example, I care about retribution, I care about rehabilitation, I care about deterrence. So all of those are likely to be very similar things that I can apply to this particular motion. And you'll get the slides later on. So what are my particular resources? I use a lot of free resources. I don't have the money for a subscription. And there are a lot of good news outlets out there. So for the Green Party one, which I just showed, right? I used CFR, which is Council on Foreign Relations. Another one I use is The Guardian because it's free. The Economist is sadly not, even though it's also a good resource. So whenever I can get free articles, I'll also go for that. Another thing is to go for the Manchester Debating Union, which is a good YouTube video series on first principles or types of motions, etc., which you might just want to learn. And this last very helpful resource is called the Debate Resource Compilation. It lists every single seminar video, every single sort of motion analysis, every single lecture series done by good debaters everywhere, compiled, and that's the link. And it's even sectioned out to things such as matter, argument construction, strategy, so you can always improve in different areas. Final things, whenever you're using matter, you want to apply it to an argument as much as possible. So you don't just leave the matter bank there because you don't actually know how to use it. So in your next drill or in your next speech that has that similar topic, try as best as you can to integrate what examples you can have or integrate the reasons that you just researched. Another thing is to make this a daily habit. So if you don't have time, I used to do this, but now I don't have a lot of time to actually look through all the articles. I'll skim over the headlines, maybe take a few minutes to see which are the most important, like the Afghanistan one. And also, if you want to strategize with your team, I think it's very good for you to share resources and research together, maybe in a shared Google Doc or Drive as well. Final part of this is on miscellaneous bits. So I broadly talked about method. I talk about matter in the middle on research. This miscellaneous bit is just, if you think you've done all of those quite well and you're still getting low speaks, or you're still getting stagnant speaks and you want to improve, some common areas of improvement is two things. The first, I think, is style, or in terms of clarity. And of course, formally, you're never actually judged on style as a different category because that would reveal certain biases, as we all know. But those biases don't actually go away. So thinking about your pace, your presentation also helps. And be specific in what parts of your speech you want to impact and really slow down and tell that to the judge one by one. This is important because X reason, or this conclusion wins us the debate because Y. So the judge can actually take that down. That is part of style and part of the way you deliver your point. The next thing is that debates are won and lost in the prep room. So there's obviously room that you want to have for team chemistry, to practice and bond with your teammates, to clarify case building dynamics, which I won't go over because it was covered in a previous seminar as well. Lastly, I just want to talk a bit about what final resource you can have. So this seminar is in collaboration with Disputandum, which is an organization I started with 2 other people. So if you want to find ways to matter research, this was an article written by one of our members, Fanes Edward Wu. And also we have articles and more articles to come on matter topics, on strategy topics, and we also have those sites as well. So that's it for this seminar. Thank you everyone for listening to this talk. I'm sorry it went a bit over time than I expected, but we still have 7 minutes actually for, I guess, a Q&A session. If anyone has any questions or doubts, please feel free to ask. You can literally ask about anything and I'll be fine. Thank you.
Thank you for the session. if anyone has any question, you could raise your hand so that, yeah, it's more organized.
Yeah. If you also don't want to speak like in public or with other people watching you, feel free to private chat your question as well. That'll totally be fine as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yeah. So I'm starting to get questions in the private chat. I'll send it to the rest of the Zoom meeting as well, so everyone can read it. Okay. So the first question is, how often should you do self-training and how long do you make schedules? And there's actually a similar question on how long I usually spend practicing by myself. So I'll answer both of those together. So I think the answer is when you're doing self-training and deciding a schedule for self-training, it actually does depend on how much you are willing and how much you're able to dedicate to that particular process. I'll be completely honest, like right now, I'm not doing as intensive self-training or as intensive research like I used to, simply because I'm sort of decreasing my participation in debating competitions for now. So of course, you also want to balance this with other things such as schoolwork as well. However, what I would suggest is that coming up to the debate competition you're preparing for, if it's like a major competition or just any competition that you want to excel in, I would say take like 1 or 2 hours each day whenever you can to dedicate yourself to that research, maybe longer in the weekends if there's a topic that you really want to know well. I think the best way to do this is to sort of strategize with your teammates, because your teammates are going to be the one that can keep you accountable, and you can even research together to make that process much more fun. So short answer is it largely depends on how much you want to succeed, and also depends on how much you're able to commit. So there is no fixed sort of schedule.
Okay, so Ditama, can you tell me where you're from and you can shoot your question?
All right, my name is Vincent Ditama. I'm from Aceh, especially Aceh Selatan. All right, I'm going to my question. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, when you wanna research bahasa Indonesia aja ya boleh ya?
Yeah, totally fine. Boleh.
Ketika misalnya kita mau nge-research nih Kak, itu kan kadang ada nih otak kita blank gitu sama emosinya. Pernah nggak Kakak gitu?
Yep, that's true.
How when you understand the motion? You got
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Is it gimana biar nggak blank gitu ya?
Ya, biar connect langsung dengan emosinya gitu. Oke.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so my answer is that you sort of need to identify why you are blanking out with emotion, because there are different ada beda-beda aspek as to why you are blanking out. It could be misalnya kamu nggak ngerti sama sekali motion itu mau ngomongin apa, because you don't understand what issue it is talking about, what the complex words actually means misalnya. Because again, debate itu sekarang motionnya mulai kompleks dan mulai panjang gitu ya. Or it could be that you know what the motion is trying to say, you're just stuck on where you want to research, dan nggak tahu mau mulai dari mana researchnya for that particular motion. So based on that, let's try to break it down. For the first problem, misalnya you don't understand what the motion is trying to say. Obviously I think you can try and take the keywords from the motion and try to clarify it. Go online and search up ini konteksnya tentang apa, kayak misalnya I don't know what the Taliban is, I'm going to do a quick Google search on that, as well as maybe ask some more experienced people you can have, or if you're completely independent in self-training and you might have some teammates who understand the motion, tanya mereka karena mereka mungkin ngerti gitu ya. For the second problem, if you already have you already know kayak motion ini secara literal artinya ini, but you don't know what argument you want to write karena ngeblank, karena nggak bisa kepikiran apa-apa, I would suggest going back to the 3 things that I mentioned earlier actually. That is, analyze kata-kata yang di dalam motion itu dan konteks motion itu lagi ngapain gitu. So if it's like the Taliban, I want to analyze Taliban ini, what are their interests, itu mereka maunya apa, and how I can use that in a debate, which I showed earlier. I also want to know misalnya if it's a motion about US trying to form closer ties with Russia misalnya, why is the US wanting to do that? I want to talk about the current context. So I'll do a quick Google search on maybe Russia-China relationship, karena US itu sebenarnya mau deket ke Russia because they want to break the tie between Russia and China misalnya. Last thing itu tentang first principle. Jadi kalau nggak terlalu ngerti motionnya or the specific issue in the motion itu ngomongin apa, I would suggest trying to take a broader topic in the motion. Like in generality, you can probably say kayak, oh motion ini kira-kira kayaknya tentang social justice movement, atau motion ini itu kayaknya tentang politics deh, atau tentang terrorism, or maybe it's about like economics misalnya. Jadi when you identify what broad topic the motion is in, you can try to start researching kayak first principles-nya dan idea-idea di dalam first principle itu. Jadi misalnya if it's motion tentang criminal justice, and I think this is a good time to actually go to this motion. Misalnya long context slide nih, and I want to research this, and I absolutely do not know what is like customs of indigenous community or non-indigenous justice system. I want to do some research on that dan cari first principle-nya apa. Jadi first principle dalam criminal justice debate itu biasanya retribution, rehabilitation, deterrence. So I want to find out how are those things achieved in an indigenous system. Jadi misalnya kalau rehabilitation, ternyata itu kalau dalam sistem hukum bagi suku dalam, itu mereka nge-prioritize rehabilitation banget. Karena they want their people to be peaceful. They don't want any more people who are overly punished. They want a connection towards like the spiritual land misalnya. Jadi I think using that research, using those 3 methods is a way to sort of clarify what the motion is saying. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, if you have a follow-up question, feel free to ask, and I'll answer this. Okay. So there's another question that I got here. Oh, sorry. The other question here is how to train your logic and strategy in independent practice when no one is there to guide you, because training logic is harder than meta research. Okay, so I think that's a really good question. And I will admit that it is one of the harder things to do because you don't have anyone to tell you like what to say, right? I think my major way of dealing with that problem is to use YouTube videos, because those are like your mini coaches as much as possible. I remember when I was self-training for NSDC selections, I would go to this recording of JOFAT or like NUDC. I would play one of the speeches. I would do my own speech and annotate. So I think the practicing of logic is very similar to a coach telling you what you should say, right? So I think practicing your logic itu sebenarnya bisa in that sense. But also I think dalam tanda kutip practicing your logic itu sebenarnya nggak terlalu jauh dari meta research. Karena from that research, you can find the underlying logic about it. Jadi misalnya, if the research is saying like more African Americans are being incarcerated because they are like doing more crimes of acquisition, misalnya they are they are stealing certain things and more of them are being caught by the police. Now using meta research, you can find the underlying logic and train your logic to think about that. Like, why would like your skin color mean that you are incarcerated more. I think it could vastly be the reason mungkin kayak mereka are structurally poorer because of the lack of opportunities they can have. And those type of statistics can actually help you train that logic in that sense. That's as much as I can say because that's how I do it. And I hope that answers your question. I guess I'll answer a few more. There's like 2 more. Okay. So I appreciate these next two, those 2 questions, and I'll answer these ones. So next one is, can you share what your motivation is in joining debate competitions? Yeah, I'll share a bit about that. So I'm personally really passionate in debating. Maybe it might be unhealthy because some people tell me I get a bit too fixated on it. But I personally joined debating. At the start, I joined it as an academic thing, mostly to boost up my CV and mostly to, get something or get an activity that's extracurricular. So I'm not just focused on academics, to sort of improve my skills in that sense. And that's still partly the reason why I joined it. I think it's just intellectually stimulating. Like I personally enjoy talking about like social movements, talking about the environment, etc. But I think personally for me, now it has evolved a bit to towards the community aspect, because the debating community is actually very, very accepting and also very friendly. And a lot of my good friends, including the friends I started this bootcamp with, did come from me joining debate competitions. That sort of become my passion. And now, like, as much as possible, I want to introduce a lot of people into debating. Like I'll drag some of my friends from my school. Like my school doesn't have a debate club, but I'll drag some of my friends to actually join debating competitions so they can experience the joy of it. I hope that answers your question. Last one, I guess, and I think this is the last one to end the session since we're going over like a bit over time. How do you manage your emotion and mental health when you felt so tired debating, like you feel very exhausted at that point, but you still have to do that? How do you keep yourself sane? This is definitely a good question because I think a lot of debaters do struggle a bit with the debate stress, with your emotion and mental health. How would I answer this? I'd probably answer this by saying the most obvious thing, which I think people should do, that as much as possible, take breaks. Debating, even though I said I fixated a lot on it, which might be unhealthy, that is the exact reason why debating is still probably not everything. To sort of, if you need to take a step back from debating because joining competition stresses you out, then definitely do so. I know some people who have done that, like maybe had a hiatus for like a few months, but then came back and they were still like very, very strong in debating as well. So that's how I sort of manage on a broader scale. If it's on a micro scale, like it's a competition and I'm exhausted, it's like 2 in the morning because of some competition that like is international, for example, and I still have to do it. Yeah, I think at least the way I do it is to keep myself sane by sort of talking to other people. So it's to be very honest with the friends and family you have, especially the friends that may also equally go towards that same stress. I think allows you to sort of connect better because you're going to that same mutual experience of stressing out over maybe like an oral adjudication. If you want to rant about the scores, about the results that you get in that last round that made you like not break into the out rounds, then totally do so. And I think there's a lot of people that will also want to help you process those emotions. Right. Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat. And as I said before, I think it's probably the last question. If I missed a question, please tell me because I don't want to skip certain questions. But if not, I think that would be the end of the question and answer session.
All right. If you have any questions, you can just like put in the chat box while we take a picture for a documentation, yeah? So if anyone can open their camera here, please do so, since we're going to like end the session soon. Okay, thank you so much for willing to open your camera.